Hey folks, I want to talk to you about this application Readeo. I strongly recommend Readeo to help grandparents and parents read to their grandchildren remotely when they can't be in the same room. Whether you're living across the country, across the world, or you're just gone on a business trip, Readeo makes it easy for you to read to those young ones when you're away. It's a super easy tool that allows for video monitoring across the top of the screen so they can see you and you can see them, as well as having the book prominently displayed, making it easy for you to read to those young ones, or better yet, having them read to you. What I want you guys to do is go to cool-grandpa.us, look for the affiliate link for Readeo, click on that link, and sign up today for your free trial. Welcome back. I'm so happy that you've joined us again for another episode of the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm sitting down today with Robin and Stephanie, who have an awesome podcast called Stories from Grandparents. Now, their podcast is talking with grandmas and grandpas, and it's having the grandchildren, adult or younger, sit down and interview their grandparents for the podcast. So you get all sorts of interesting conversations and stories. You guys are really going to enjoy their perspective on gathering stories from grandparents. Be sure to check the show notes out on the website for a link to their podcast, their website, and where you can find them. Now, without further ado, let's get on to the show. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hi, Robin. Hi, Stephanie. Thank you guys so much for being on the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I sure do appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us and talk about your awesome podcast, the Stories from Grandparents. I'm excited to hear more about how you guys came up with this idea and everything that's driving you guys to do this podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. I really appreciate it. Yeah, our podcast was just it's funny, like I used to have a job where I had to drive a lot, and so I used to listen to a lot of podcasts because they kind of keep you company when you're on the road. And I had thought, like, I want to start a podcast. I just like couldn't think of an idea for so long. But I also used to make a lot of phone calls when I drive because that passes the time too, just on Bluetooth or whatever. And I would call my grandma and she'd end up telling me, stories, really just chatting about life and whatever. And sometimes she'd get into a story about like when she was a kid or, talking about my grandfather or my dad when he was a kid. And that is kind of where the spark started. But I was trying to think of an idea of like, what can I do for a podcast? I initially wanted to start a podcast about coincidences, like, cause I love a good coincidence story. They're so like satisfying, and then I was talking to my husband about it. He's like, no, it's too broad. And then finally I remember the night we came up with Stories from Grandparents. And I was like, it could be this, it could be people interviewing their grandparents about life events, moments in history, family legends, family gossip, parent stories, just any kind of reflections like that, because I love that dynamic between a grandchild and a grandparent and just hearing that love that exists there. I think it's so cool. And then, so I had this idea and I knew I only knew Steph at like an arm's length. Hey.
Yeah. We had mutual friends.
Yeah. And, but I had her on Facebook as a friend and she would do podcast reviews. And I knew we liked some of the same content. So when I thought of this idea, I reached out and asked her if she wanted to co-host, and you were not interested.
Well, I was, so because I thought I was just going to be like a sounding board. Like, yeah. I thought she's like, oh, like, I just, I know you like podcasts. Like, I was wondering if this is a good idea or not. And I guess it wasn't clear right away that like she wanted me to do it with her. And but then she like told me the idea and I was like, oh, that's really cool. And she's a lot more like she's closer. She still has her, grandparents that she's close with. And for me, like, I just love the idea of like family stories in general.
Mhm.
And I thought it was like such a cool idea, and it's so universal because most people, you know, have grandparents. And yeah, and so then I got on board. And really the nice thing is that like we became friends doing this podcast.
Yes. Yeah.
And we've now been working on this. So I think she came over to talk to me about her podcast in like December 2017
Mhm.
or something. And now we're, you know, working on a second season.
Mhm.
And yeah, friendship going strong.
Yeah. And podcast too.
Yeah, and the podcast.
So yeah, it's Stories from Grandparents, and it's the podcast that captures stories about and from grandparents. And it can be grandchildren interviewing their grandparents, or people just telling stories about their grandparents. And or we can have grandparents on telling about their life and their grandparents, or whatever. It's pretty flexible, and it's just been a really fun project and a lot of work too.
Oh, yeah. I
Yes.
think that's one of the things that a lot of people underestimate about podcasts, right? It's like I can get a microphone, it'll plug into the laptop, maybe I get a set of decent headphones, and then I'm ready to go. And it's like, no. There's a
No.
lot more work. There's okay, you got to buy a URL and a website and do a subscription for this, and then you find out that it's not just putting a file onto a website. It's, oh, I need a podcast hosting service. So now
Yeah.
I've got to go do that and set that up and do, yeah. So it's some work to get that going.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
yeah, it's
But just
involved.
for us, it's the editing. It's like
Yeah.
our podcast is fully edited. And so like that's what is the most time consuming. But yeah, there is a lot of parts. I actually forgot about that whole process of like finding the hosting service, and you know, how do we get like one with a player embedded, and I don't know, just all these things
Right.
that seem like it would be really straightforward. But it's not. And when we first
It's
started, we
really
were
not.
going in a studio. Like we rented studio time.
Oh,
There's a
okay.
podcast, a pop-up podcast like thing here in Ottawa. So we would do that, which seems kind of crazy now. But yeah, no, it was great. And that's the podcast. And we definitely hope people check it out.
Yo, for
Or
sure.
come on if you're interested in coming on.
Yes, we actually, can I just put a
Yeah.
call out for actual grandparents?
Yeah.
Because it's been surprisingly hard to find grandparents to be interviewed by their grandchildren, especially of the older generations. For whatever reason, they're hard to recruit. So it's mostly been people talking about, like, sharing stories about their grandparents. But
Yeah.
we would love to hear more grandparents come on.
Well, and I
Yeah.
think if I had to take a guess on where that reluctance comes from is, I think sometimes as we get older, and you guys are way too young for this, but as an old guy myself, when you get older, you start to discount your life a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think what's awesome is when you're talking about people that are sharing stories about their grandparents, you realize how extraordinary every life can be.
Mm-hmm.
But as somebody that's essentially lived that life or seen that story, you know, you kind of go, yeah, you know, I did a few things here and there, but it's nothing special. But then you got one of the episodes I was listening to is you were talking with somebody whose Italian grandfather went from Italy to Scotland, ran away from home, jumped on a ship, ended up in Uruguay and Buenos Aires, had this adventure and this story of, you know, this whole thing in this whorehouse, goes up to Nova Scotia, I think, you know, thumbs a ride, you know, learns to jump a train, rides the train down for a while till he gets kicked off, and then, you know, sneaks his way into Philadelphia.
Yeah. Crazy, hey?
It's absolutely crazy. But I'm sure if we talked to that grandfather, he'd be like, you know, I kind of did some things. Yeah, I jumped on the ship and I did this and I did that. But they would have a tendency to downplay it. So
it's true. It's true. And that was a remarkable one. And what's crazy about that story is like that I remember like all of that stuff happened in this life at the starting that this kid was 16 when this happened. It's like a stowaway on a ship and all these things, right? And then where the podcast ended, where that story ended was the beginning of World War II.
Yeah.
Like all of that happened. And then it was the start of World War II. And then he was interned. He actually got interned and sent back to Canada because he was Italian and stuff. And he was like the bad guys, one of the bad guys in World War II. And it's like, we didn't even get into that. Like the amount that generations has seen in their life is so incredible. And I think you're right. It's like if they might not think it's remarkable, but it is.
Oh yeah. And the point that is that, if you're a grandma or grandpa or somebody around that age, you need to reach out to Robin and Stephanie and tell some of these stories so they get captured. I mean, I'm a Gen X grandfather, right? So I remember when punk was coming out and CBGB was the scene up in New York. And I remember the Ramones and I remember Billy Idol. I remember all these different things. I remember when U2 was an opening band for people, right?
Wow.
And saw REM when they were playing small arenas.
Ooh,
and
that's good.
These different things. And that's just a Gen X grandfather that can talk about, hey, I saw this band and I saw that band and I saw this music that was happening. I saw MTV when they used to play music on TV. And
those were the days.
Right. And it's, I think what I want to make sure is that, and what's awesome with your stories is that every single life is extraordinary in some aspect.
Absolutely.
And it could be the going through the depressions, and you don't even have to think about necessarily even my grandparents, but what my mom went through and that generation that was coming up, that boomer generation that was coming through, and they had extraordinary times. I mean, talk about all the social upheaval of the 60s, and it's amazing because not everybody was a greaser and not everybody was a hippie and not everybody was this or that, or, that whole thing affected people. So it's great to get these stories. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I would say like, even, in addition to the stories, there's also the wisdom, right? Especially if they've lived a long life, that they've, been able to share advice, with their family and their friends. Like there can be a lot of value. And I hope that one of the main takeaways from our podcast is to encourage people, if they don't want to participate on our podcast, fine, I will accept, but they should record themselves with their grandparents just to have that, to have their voices on tape, to have those stories and that wisdom. That's something that you can treasure forever, even if you don't want to share the audio with us. You do it for yourself. I think it's such a treasure for those that have that. We interviewed a friend of mine who had interviewed his grandfather as a journalist on his history with horse racing. And just, the fact that he has that audio that he can revisit and hear his grandfather's stories again is just such a beautiful thing.
Oh, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more, because I think we're so lucky to have the technology we have that, we don't necessarily have to rely on journals or scribblings on the back of still pictures, that we have an opportunity to, use those iPhones, use those Android phones, so I get both sides in there. But, use the technology that we have, get those recordings, because what will be interesting is, and maybe this has come up with you guys, is when those grandchildren and even great-grandchildren now have the ability to hear their grandmother and hear their grandfather and hear, put a voice to a picture, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I just wanted to touch on like the story that you brought up. That is a really, remarkable story with a lot of like traveling and adventure. But even the stories that, where just growing up in a different time, like my grandmother, she never left Nova Scotia. She barely left the town she was born in. She had 9 kids, like just having 9 kids alone, like the stories the stories that get told around my mom's family's kitchen table are really something. And like I remember my grandma like saying things like just things we wouldn't think about today. you would never bring your baby in the grocery store. She's like, you'd never bring a baby in a grocery store. She said you'd get to the grocery store and lined up outside, there would be all these baby carriages and like strollers just lined up outside because you wouldn't bring your baby in a store, but you'd think nothing of leaving your baby outside the store. Like, can you imagine just parking your baby outside of a grocery store, let alone if you have like a bunch of them and just leaving and going shopping? But it's things like that, just those stories of a different time, I feel are so valuable. So yeah, definitely anyone, please reach out. We love any stories, even if you don't think they're remarkable, they probably are.
Yeah. Now, what has been some of the reaction to the podcast so far? What's been some of the feedback that you've gotten? Because what's interesting is that you don't have just one episode that's one story. A lot of times it's multiple stories, multiple people per episode. Mm-hmm. And the stories sometimes have a little bit of a theme that crosses over, but sometimes they're just perfectly good standalone 5-minute, 10-minute, stories. So what's been some of the feedback that you guys have received?
We've had some really good feedback. A lot of people have said that they found it really comforting during the pandemic to listen to these family stories, especially because they couldn't get together with their families. We've had a lot of lockdowns and stuff like that up in Canada. And it's also been really nice to hear. I remember a friend of ours had posted about like just bawling in her kitchen at one of our episodes, that was like especially sad. Like there's one about caretaking, mm-hmm. And that really resonated with her. And so it's been really interesting to hear sort of the range of reactions as well, because there's some that are sad and there's some that are funny and there's some that are, epic, like the one you were talking about with the grandfather running away from home when he's just a teenager. Actually, the funny thing about that one too, we actually had to cut a lot of it out. There were more dramatic things that happened in that story that we just had to cut for time. Like he was riding the rails and came across this group of men that took him in, and they got drunk. This was in Quebec somewhere. They got drunk and they were throwing dynamite around near like a wood stove or something. Wasn't that right, Robin?
Yeah.
And anyway, and it was crazy and interesting, but the episode was so long, that there was like a bunch of stuff like that. It was just such a crazy story.
It was too many beats. It almost made it just became unbelievable, even though I believe it happened. It just became like we gotta cut it out somewhere, right? So yeah. But yeah, I think that's the main reaction, that it's comforting, that it's a heartwarming podcast. We've gotten really good feedback about like the production value, which was a huge compliment because frankly, we had no idea what we were doing. And just like from our intro to our editing and how we chose the stories to go together, we tried to find themes in our interviews, whether it was stories of, like love stories, caretaking, immigration was a really big one. A lot of grandparent generations have gone through like immigration stories, or displacement stories. And so, what other ones have we had, Steph?
About wasting. We had one, we have an episode on ghosts. Yeah. There's a couple ghost stories. Although I will say that for this second season that we've been working on, so far we don't really have any themed episodes. They've mostly been standalone, just because they just like stood on their own. Like there was so much to share for each person, or it was like a much longer story. So this upcoming season, it's going to be a little different, but still a good variety in terms of subject matter and tone, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Now, one of the things that I'd like to understand too a little bit more is the relationships that you guys had with your own grandparents, and how that may have even influenced a little bit of why you went into this podcast. And I know, Robin, you talked a little bit about that with the conversation with your grandmother when you're driving around. But Steph, how about you? What was the relationship like with your grandparents?
So I did not live in the same city as my grandparents growing up. And so I saw them, I don't know, a handful of times a year, I guess. And my maternal grandfather and my paternal grandmother died when I was young. And then I had the other two for a little while longer into my 20s. But the ones that I actually saw the most were at the ones that I still have, my stepmom's parents. So my stepmom came into my life when I was 15, and her parents did live in the same city as us, and they really treated us like their own grandchildren. I would say, like, from the beginning. They're just like really wonderful people. Like, if my grandmother knew that we were coming over, she would bake us something ahead of time. My grandfather, uh, it's just like a very warm, just warm, generous people. And yeah, it's always just been really lovely to go visit them, and just like they're just very welcoming. We can talk about all kinds of things. Unfortunately, my grandfather has Alzheimer's now, and that's been hard to watch. Just the amount of words that he's lost over time, and how that relationship changes. But yeah, I find, like, from that, really seeing the impact that grandparents can have in your life, and just being able to talk about all kinds of things. Unfortunately, they did not want to be interviewed for our podcast, but I had asked to interview them, like, even years before, but they're just, yeah, they didn't feel comfortable, being recorded, I think, in sharing their life, even though, yeah, like, as we've said, like, so many people have led remarkable lives, and even though they wouldn't necessarily define it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sure. Now, I'm curious, what were some of the things that your step grandparents did when you were first establishing that relationship that created an opening for you to establish that? Because sometimes it can be difficult. I mean, even for step parents coming into a relationship, let alone you've got these step grandparents that sometimes they may not even know, where do I fit in, and are these kids going to like us? There's a lot of navigation and a lot of questioning from the grandparents' side of that. So I'm curious to know what are some things that you remember that they did to open up to you?
That's a really good question. And honestly, like, it's not something I spent a lot of time thinking about, because I think it was so organic and natural. And I guess that speaks to the approach maybe that they had, which I can't imagine was intentional. Like, I can't imagine them setting out being like, okay, like, this is how we're going to be. I think they were just really authentically themselves. And as I said, like, they were really welcoming. They sought out ways to connect with us. They always made an effort to make us feel welcome. They took an interest in, our lives. They're also very thoughtful people. And so, as I said, like, my grandmother would remember, that I love pumpkin bread, for example, or, different things like that. So, like, she would make them ahead of time, like, if she knew I was coming over. They've always just been, like, yeah, very generous with their time. And I remember, when my sister and I started a tradition every year. There's a campaign called Oxfam Unwrapped, where, as, like, usually around Christmas, you can, like, buy a goat, or like a flock of chickens, or books for kids, and Oxfam passes that on. So you're giving basically on behalf of, so for my grandparents, we had started doing that. We had we bought them all kinds of things, like, over the years, and that, like, they're such good Christian people, and so generous themselves, that like really moved them. Instead of buying them, like, a sweater or a pair of pants or whatever, something they can buy themselves, like, they're such kind-hearted people. And I think that's how they came off. So they were just really easy to get along with, and they were always very inclusive, and, like I said, just like taking an interest. That it was all very smooth. Like, I don't really remember awkwardness, even though I was a teenager and was probably like, not always pleasant. I don't know.
Teenage girls are the most terrifying people.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But they were so nice. They were so nice. And that whole family really were really welcoming. But for them, it was honestly, and they're very just like affectionate, lovely people. Yeah. I was very lucky.
Yeah, very lucky.
Well, and it sounds like there was some intentionality there in terms of making sure that they were putting their best foot forward as that relationship was getting started, and then being intentional with finding out what your interests were, what your likes were, and, taking the extra initiative to make sure that it wasn't necessarily over the top, but it was the little things. It was the pumpkin bread, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Doing little things like that are like, hey, when Steph comes over, she is really going to enjoy this. So,
yeah.
It's not a manipulative thing, but it's a very intentional,
yeah.
kind of,
even then, like, I mean, I say that I'm sure they do that for lots of other people too, though. Like, I feel like it is just, how they are, but either way, very nice.
Yeah.
Whether they, had that intention or not, I think it's just like in their heart, that they want to make whoever comes over feel welcome.
Well, I think that's a great lesson for, potential step grandparents or grandparents that are going into that, welcoming in new children into the family, is making sure that you're finding out what those grandkids like. What do they enjoy? What are their interests? And being intentional about discovering that and finding those ways to connect with them, because everybody all the way around is trying to figure out if this relationship's going to work. How's it going to work? What are we doing? Because there's a lot of people involved in that didn't really have a say-so about how they came together, but they're together. So, grandparents can do a big, play a big part of connecting with those grandchildren, and then helping the family in general. That kind of eases everybody into these new relationships.
Yeah, I totally agree. They can really be the glue in, like, a new family situation. Yeah, that's great.
Robin, let's talk a little bit about the situation with your grandparents, because I think you lived with your grandparents for a little while, didn't you?
Yeah, they did. They did when I was young. Like, my parents were young parents, and they, were just trying to, I think, kind of figure out life and, what their careers would be. And my dad had actually moved down to Georgia for a bit, and we were supposed to move there, I remember. But during that year, it was my first year of school. I lived with my grandparents. And yeah, I think it's a relationship that I didn't reflect on much until I was an adult. But now I see what a solid foundation that was in my life. And my grandparents house is my safe space. Truly, I can say it's one of my true happy places in the world, that when I'm there, I feel like I'm home, like I'm where I'm supposed to be. And just like a completely safe place where, like, me and my nan and pap will sit at the kitchen table. Like, it's funny, the last time we were there, we kept staying up too late, and we have kids, like, they're up early, right? Like, like, they're up at like 5:30 or 6. And we kept saying, like, okay, tonight we're going to go to bed nice and early. We'll go to bed by 9:00. And every night we ended up staying up later and later, just talking, because we just like are enjoying each other's company so much. And, hearing about, their lives and different stories, and, what's going on around town to what things were like when they were kids. And yeah, it's truly great place.
That's so nice.
What were some of the things that they were doing with you as you were young, as far as activities and interests and some of those relationship building moments?
Well, so much of it was just kind of child rearing in a way, because we lived there. And so I remember just kind of day-to-day life with them when I was young and we were there. One thing that a story that I don't remember this, but we had to take the bus to school, me and my brother. And I remember my pap would come down. They had a long driveway, and he'd come down to the end of the driveway every day to meet me to get off the bus. And he ran a business from home. He's a mechanic, and he ran a business from home. And one day he was like caught up with a customer, and he didn't come down and meet us. And then he realized that I hadn't come off the bus, and he went down to the end of the driveway, and I was just laying there in the grass.
Oh.
I don't know if I thought like maybe I wasn't supposed to walk up without him. But my pap met me at the bus at like he met me when I got off the bus every day, and we walk up the driveway together. And, I talked to him about what I learned and whatever. And then they were like, "What are you doing? Why didn't you just come up?" And I was like, I don't know. Like, so yeah, it's little things like that I guess were just our little routines and traditions. My grandpa now, he's quite deaf. And so he's not as comfortable to like talk on the phone, and he's been like that for a long time, like since I was a kid. And we ended up moving from Nova Scotia to BC, so we were really far away. And so we didn't talk on the phone as much. But when I'm there, I'd say it's those moments of just like those quiet minutes after dinner when you just like sitting having tea, watching a show together and then like chatting about it after. Those are the really intentional moments from my grandfather that he took the time to spend. Yeah.
Well, I think that's awesome in the sense that it reinforces that the time spent with grandchildren, not everything has to be, riding the roller coaster type of event, right? It's a lot of times it's these small, quiet moments. It's, sitting down, watching TV together or going fishing together or taking a drive somewhere. And it's these ordinary moments that create those quality times of just being around grandpa or grandma.
Yeah, it's true. And I know when we were there, we just went there this past summer with our kids for the first time. And I feel like for one of the first times in my memory, my grandpa started talking about when his father went to war in World War II. And it was like months sometimes that you didn't know what happened to your loved one, right? Like it was all letters and stuff. And so he talked about, although I don't know if he remembers this or was told this, he said that they got a letter in the mail saying that my grandfather had gone missing, that his plane was shot down. And then they didn't get communication again for another 2 months. And so I'm just imagining my great grandmother with these two young boys she had at that time and not knowing if your husband is dead or alive for 2 months. And fortunately he was alive. He did survive. Wow. But like to get back to like my grandpa sharing the story, I just felt like he was being really vulnerable with us and really talking about a moment, like talking about what that must have been like for his mother. And it's those like little times that you take to just share about yourself and your life and reflect. And that's what's so great about stories from grandparents in general, is they teach you about history and yourself and your family. And it's just like those are really special times that we have with him. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And I can just imagine what it must be like, for the wives and mothers that were back home to get those messages, right? Hey, so-and-so's missing.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. And then you don't know if you're a widow or not. You don't know. Mm-hmm. And after the initial shock, until you hear more, what do you do with your life? Because if you start down one path and then it's a different outcome, mm-hmm. That messes with your life.
Totally.
Yeah.
It must have been so terrifying. Yeah. But it's just like, when we're kind of actually, Steph and I were talking before this, I really had to reflect on my relationship specifically with my grandfather for this podcast, which, like, considering what we do, you'd think would be easy. But because I have to admit, I am closer with my grandmother. I was closer to both my grandmothers than my grandfathers. And I'm trying to think of why that is, but like when I think about that moment with my pap, like what that was like, just hearing him share that about his family, it's just this quiet support, and that like it's my grandma's probably the more active one. She's the one who'll pick up the phone and call. She's the one who seems more kind of involved in my day-to-day life. But my grandma always makes sure to let me know, your pap always asks about you. He always asks about the kids. He always, whatever. And yeah, he's very, very present, and it's a really special relationship, and like a quietly supportive relationship is how I describe it.
Well, it's been interesting too, as I've interviewed a number of women about their grandfathers and relationships with grandfathers, because I think that sometimes that relationship, it ebbs and flows between one or the other, depending on age and interests and personalities. There's a lot of different variables to that. But I think the one thing that a lot of the women that I've talked to have come back with is that stability of grandpa is grandpa. He's been kind of this way since I've known him. And,
so true. Yeah.
It's been those quiet moments, and we talked about that a little bit. And I don't know why it is. I probably could, get a university research grant maybe and figure it out. But I think it's that stability there, and that, grandpa's not necessarily doing a lot of the baking or some of the traditional things in the kitchen or around the house, but grandpas now do tend to get down on the ground and play dolls and roughhouse a little bit with the girls. And but then it's the quiet moments. It's like I said, I've had women that have said, hey, when things were rough at home, I could go play checkers with grandpa. And that kind of calmed me down. We wouldn't talk about anything, but we would just play checkers when things were rough, or they would have different connections. So it's interesting to see how those relationships get to be different. And I've had a number of grandfathers that have come on and have warned other grandfathers and said, look, when you have granddaughters, they're going to run, and you and your wife walk through the door. Understand that when your granddaughter goes charging up to your wife and gives her a big hug first, it's nothing personal. It's just that's how it is. And then they've also said, now, okay, grandmas, when you get there and your grandson comes running up, he's going to come running and blow right past you and go and try to tackle grandpa or climb on grandpa or do something. It's like, that's just kind of how it is. Now, it's a broad brush and, and all that. But it is interesting, that dynamic. And I think your stories kind of pull on that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Another role I think he plays in our family is like it just kind of that traditional patriarchal figure. And there's definitely, it must be really hard, like as a parent, like I'm thinking about them parenting my dad and seeing him make bad decisions for his family sometimes, like they were young and there's not, not always doing what was best. That must have been really hard for my grandfather. I can imagine that, but he still plays this role of keeping the family in line. A little example I have is like when I was getting married, I got married in Nova Scotia, and there was like a lot of moving pieces. Weddings are so much work, and like we had like kind of got everything figured out. We had all our booze for the bar. We had hired bartenders. I didn't have any ice. And I called the grocery store in town and they had no ice. Their ice machine was like broken or something. And my dad was there, and I'd asked my dad, he had to drive about like half hour to get ice for the wedding. I said, Dad, I like the morning, I need you to drive to Wallace, and I've ordered all this ice and I need you to pick it up and whatever. And my dad was like, oh, like I'm in hot, like, what is he going to do it? And my grandpa was watching this interaction, and he's a little bit deaf, right? So he didn't like intervene right then. And he could tell that I was really stressed out. My dad left the room, and I basically at the end of it, I was unclear of whether my dad was going to get this ice. And he said, what's the address of where the ice is? And he said, your dad's going to get that ice. He's going tomorrow. Don't worry about it. Your dad's going to get that ice. And like, I was just so like, oh yeah, there's someone here who has authority over my dad, and it's the Hap. And it was so awesome, because it was like, just like when you're trying to deal with everything, I don't want to be dealing with this ice right now. I'm the bride,
Right.
Like, and it was just really nice that he like took charge of several situations that weekend to do with the family, and made it all run smoothly, because it's like, this is, his granddaughter's wedding. He wanted to go smoothly. So it was great.
Like a boss.
Like a total boss. Like, your dad's going to get that ice. I was like, oh yeah, because you're his dad and you tell him what to do. Like, so it was really nice.
Oh, that's funny. That reminds me a little bit. I'll tell you guys this story, since podcast is about stories a little bit. is that my wife and our oldest son, and this is before I came into the picture and married her and adopted them and all that. But would always, as a stubborn 3-4-year-old, is I'm not going to do what you're telling me to. He's going through those things, and mom is, yes, you are. Why? Because I'm the boss of you, right? And so he figured out, okay, mom's the boss of me. Well, when they went to Los Angeles to visit my wife's mother, and they were he's trying to figure out everybody's relationships and what's going on. And it's like, this is my mother. And so it's like, oh, so you're mom's boss. And then that was where, totally. My wife's mom became grandma boss, because when he was that age, it was like, grandma boss is mom's boss and mom is my boss. He was kind of starting to put this thing together, and that's a funny story, but I think it's good to also remember that, as well as that, hey, as grandkids, if your grandfathers and grandmothers are still around and you need some backup on some things, call in the grandparents to
the reinforcement,
to help get mom and dad, take care of what needs to get taken care of.
Yeah, totally. And my dad does. You can see that he has that reverence for my pap still. So that was it's nice. It's nice to have that support.
That's awesome. So what's the best way that the audience can jump in and find your podcast and listen to all the stories that you guys have?
Well, they can find us pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. We're on, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. I personally use Pocket Casts. We're pretty much everywhere. They can also find us at storiesfromgrandparents.com. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. All kinds of places as a way to dive in. Honestly, you don't have to listen to them in any kind of order. So I would suggest, go with the title that intrigues you. I mean, a personal favorite, I think, for both Robin and I is the second episode, which is the Sim family one, where my friend Natasha and her cousin interviewed their grandmother, and it's lovely. And the Family Legends podcast, the episode is really fun. They're all good. Listen to all of them.
Yeah. No, they're very entertaining, and I like that they're at least in the season were little bite-sized chunks. Some were longer than others, but and there's a few of the folks that gave you guys the caveat of, this is how the stories come down within our family.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of like, we're not exactly sure if this is true or not.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. And then if folks wanted to come on and share a story about their grandparents, or bring their grandparents on with them and do an interview with their grandparents with you guys, what's the good email for that? Is that the Gmail?
Yes. Stories from Grandparents podcast @gmail.com.
Okay. And we'll be sure to put links to all that in the show notes as well. But I wanted to make sure that people got a chance to hear about your awesome podcast, and then also hopefully we get a few people that will raise their hand and volunteer to either come on as grandparents that want to share a story, or come on and tell you some stories about their grandparents.
Exactly. We'd love that.
That would be awesome. We're always recruiting.
Yes.
Oh yeah. And folks, the other bonus part of this is not only that you get to share, your stories about your awesome grandparents, or as grandparents about what you're doing and how your life has been, but you create this little digital archive that you can download and you can save it, and it can be something that goes, to your grandchildren and great grandchildren. So they hear at least a couple of stories that are in your own voice. So I encourage you guys to reach out to Stephanie and Robin, and, get on the stories from grandparents. Get out there and help them out.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And again, folks, go out, check this out. Stories from Grandparents. The website is storiesfromgrandparents.com. You can find them all over the place, Stitcher, iTunes, wherever your favorite podcasts are sold. Little joke. But all seriousness, check them out. These are awesome stories, and they're doing great work in helping to celebrate grandparents and the roles that grandparents can have on their children and their families. So thanks again, Stephanie and Robin. I really do appreciate you being on the Cool Grandpa podcast.
Oh, thanks for having us on.
Wow, what a great conversation with Robin and Stephanie. I really enjoyed hearing their experience with their grandparents and all the things that they went through. I love this idea of, when you've got a grandparent that's still around, how they can help you wrangle your parents in certain situations because they've got the authority, right? Just like that story I had about my son and his grandma boss. So that was a fun conversation. If you are interested in having a conversation with your grandparents on their podcast, please go to their website, storiesfromgrandparents.com, and look for the link to get signed up to be on their podcast. It's really easy, and you may just stumble into some stories that you didn't even know about. Stephanie and Robin's podcast is on Apple, Spotify, all the major podcast platforms, so it'll be easy to find them. But if you need to, go to the show notes. I've got the links to their podcast and their website and everything in the show notes. And until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.